Tonight, the standoff between the U.S. and Iran. How will this play out? Both nations amplifying the rhetoric while also appealing for calm. Iran labels the U.S. airstrike that killed the top general an act of war. Plus, the president keeps on threatening to attack Iran's cultural sites, a threat no one on his staff is embracing. So why is he doing it, and what exactly are these sites that he keeps eyeing? And later, two major developments to report tonight in the impeachment of major players here. The man Democrats most want to hear from now says he'll talk. So the top Republican in the Senate says he's got the votes to start a trial without any witnesses. Evening, everybody, and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. Thanks for joining us. We're going to spend much of our hour focused on the standoff between the U.S. and Iran as the world waits to see what happens next. And I should mention, we'll be joined by Liz Holtzman, a major player in Watergate, to talk about those impeachment developments. Now, speaking of Iran, as part of our conversation tonight, we're going to bring you into our debate regarding Iran and where we go from here. We're going to be asking for your take on the U.S. standoff with Iran and how the president has handled it to this point. Was there, do you believe, an imminent threat? Are you worried this thing could escalate into something far bigger and harder to manage? Do you trust what President Trump is telling us and his capacity to handle the situation as it unfolds? The phone lines, they are open now. Join us at 888-RNN-CHAT. That's 888-766-2428. We will get to your calls in just a few minutes. But first, someone or something has got to give here. Neither the Trump administration nor the Iranian government, they're backing down in any way, shape, or form. And the government in Tehran saying the airstrike that President Trump ordered that killed one of their top generals was, in their words, an act of war. Also adding the U.S. will pay for its actions. As the U.S. anticipates Iran's retaliation for the killing of General Qasem Soleimani, Defense Secretary Mark Esper today urging Iran to come back to the negotiating table.
Let me reiterate that the United States is not seeking a war with Iran, but we are prepared to finish one.
Esper stating that the U.S.'s airstrike that took out one of Iran's top military commanders was an act of self-defense. The Trump administration claiming it had information Soleimani was plotting to kill significant numbers of American soldiers and diplomats in the coming days.
He was conducting, preparing, planning military operations. He was a legitimate target, and his time was due.
But Iran's foreign minister, Javad Zarif, said it is the U.S. that crossed the line. Zarif, who was set to attend a UN Security Council meeting on Thursday, was denied a visa to enter the U.S. This morning, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo wouldn't comment on the matter, but said
Zarif is a propagandist of the First Order.
Pompeo then dismissed Zarif's claim that Soleimani was on a diplomatic peace mission in Iraq when he was killed. Iraq's prime minister also has stated he had a meeting scheduled with the Iranian general the day he was killed to discuss de-escalating regional tensions.
He was traveling with the head of Hezbollah. They weren't there to discuss a vacation. They were there to discuss bad business, and we saved a lot of lives.
The Iraqi parliament took a non-binding vote to expel U.S. troops from the country. And Monday, the U.S. delivered a letter to the Iraqi military saying they would respect that vote with plans on how they depart. But Esper says that letter was a mistake, and the U.S. will maintain its presence.
Our policy has not changed. We are not leaving Iraq.
And there's a lot more to report on Iran tonight, and for that, I want to bring in our senior political correspondent, Andrew Whitman.
And Rich, this is a little unusual because for a military incident involving the U.S. over the weekend, there still remains on Tuesday an unusual amount of unanswered questions tonight. And the growing standoff presents a slew of other issues that need to be considered, including whether the decision to target Soleimani was legal. We know that Soleimani was not on the battlefield at the time he was targeted, which means he has to present an imminent threat to the United States at the time in order to be legally targeted. So the U.S. has been saying that he was, but the government's offered no evidence, relying only on vague claims based on intelligence, which is a problem for this administration, given how often they've bashed U.S. intelligence agencies when doing so is advantageous for Donald Trump.
I can assure you that it's more than razor thin, and it's persuasive. I think the threat was being orchestrated by Soleimani. That's what the intelligence reported. That's what he was doing on the ground in both Baghdad, in Damascus, and elsewhere. And I think it was only a matter of days, certainly no more than weeks.
But despite what Esper is saying, that may not add up to an imminent threat. Other Trump officials are saying even less, like, trust me, and the details don't matter.
When you say the attacks were imminent, how imminent were they?
If you're an American in the region, days and weeks, this is not something that's relevant.
So still no concrete answers, and the longer the administration fails to advise lawmakers or the American public about just what imminent threat Soleimani posed, the less likely they will be to be believed, and the less help they're likely to get on whatever comes next with Iran, which is one of the reasons Democrats on the Hill are already preparing to vote on invoking the rarely used war powers resolution that forces the president to limit any military action and keep Congress in the loop on what's happening. The standoff with Iran also straining our relationship with Iraq, where about 5,000 U.S. troops remained stationed. This weekend, the Iraqi parliament voted to expel the U.S. from the country. That vote is not binding, but it put Defense Secretary Mark Esper in an awkward position yesterday and led to even more questions about whether the Trump administration has any game plan for the region in place at all. A letter from the Iraqi government leaked out, or to the Iraqi government leaked out, saying that the U.S. forces in Iraq would be relocating to prepare for onward movement. In other words, a withdrawal. But within hours, Esper claimed that letter was a draft that shouldn't have been released, which is unusual. And it's a claim that's not exactly passing the sniff test in many quarters. And all of this as the questions continue about just how President Trump made the decision to target Soleimani, whether it was a carefully considered move or an impulsive reaction from an impulsive president. The New York Times reporting that the Pentagon gave Trump a range of options on dealing with Iranian aggression, and he chose the most extreme choice. The Times reporting that, quote, after initially rejecting the Soleimani option on December 28th and authorizing airstrikes on an Iranian-backed Shiite militia group instead, a few days later, Mr. Trump watched fuming as television reports showed Iranian-backed attacks on the American embassy in Baghdad. According to Defense Department and administration officials, by late Thursday, the president had gone to the extreme option. Top Pentagon officials say they were stunned. The report also says some senior officials were disputing the intelligence that was warning of the imminent threat to Americans, plus both the Times and the Washington Post reporting that the president took action out of concern that he would look weak if he did not. Which brings us to our final and perhaps most frightening angle on the Iran story, that no one, not even our closest allies, are backing us in this standoff. How alone is Donald Trump on Iran? Israel, our closest ally in the region and a blood enemy of Iran, praised the attack while distancing themselves from it, calling it an American event, not an Israeli one. But almost no other nation embraced it at all, including Saudi Arabia, Iran's biggest Arab enemy in the region. Great Britain, France, and Germany all turning their backs on Trump's actions. So if the United States decides to continue with the standoff with Iran, it will almost certainly do so alone, something the U.S. has done rarely, if ever, since the end of the Second World War. Rich?
Andrew, thank you very much here. And again, a reminder, everybody, we're getting to your phone calls shortly on this developing event. But for more context, let's bring in our next guest, Kendric Robbins. Kendric, he's an adjunct professor of national security strategy at the American Security Project, and he also served more than 20 years in the U.S. Army and also served as a special assistant to the Army Chief of Staff. We've already started to see some of the fallout for this, but before we get to where we go from here, let's talk about how we got to this position in the first place. And I found it interesting. I'm going through Bergen's new book, which gets an insight to some of the generals that were in the Trump administration, at least in the beginning of his term. And specifically, Mattis tried to either slow play or even stop some of the worst impulses the president had as to escalating issues with Iran. And he intentionally didn't put options on the table that were so extreme here that normally would dissuade a president to more of the moderate positions, but he was afraid he would take it. How much of the situation we find ourselves is that there is no more Mattis, there is no more Kelly, there is no more McMaster, there really is no one surrounding the presidents with some ground knowledge of what it was like in the Middle East from personal, first-hand experience?
Yeah, that's a great point, Richard. I think what's going on right now in the administration is with General Mattis gone, Mark Esper is a great American, but he doesn't have the strong personality that a General Mattis had. You also see John Bolton's not at the table anymore, and the current national security advisor, again, not as strong a personality. So I think clearly the president is leaning very heavily on Secretary Pompeo. I suspect that Secretary Pompeo weighed in very heavily, and without those other advisors, kind of at the table to discuss this, it's likely the president is listening very closely to Secretary Pompeo and maybe not as closely to others.
To that end, I thought it was interesting. By all accounts, Soleimani's a horrible guy. And I think, at least from the people I've spoken to, I defer to you, a legitimate target. It seemed that this was avoidable in that we didn't have to be alone in this. I found it telling that two of the groups that we would think would be doing cartwheels over this, the Israelis as well as the Saudis, who have huge issues with Iran, neither of them said, yeah, we're with you on this. They said this was America's action, and while they don't miss that Soleimani's gone, they made it clear that they didn't have fingerprints on this. Moreover, none of our other allies, and this has been, I guess, 3 years in the making with NATO, et cetera, forget about we're consulted, but we're ever brought in on this. It seems, I don't know the upside when the Iranians now say they're talking about, forget about, they're going to pull out completely out of the nuclear accord. Maybe, they're on the road to getting a nuke. Moreover here, we've shut down all forward operations where we're training partners, and moreover, we're going after ISIS. Now, we're basically retrenching, waiting for the reaction from the Iranians. To me, I guess my only point is, it didn't have to be this way, did it?
Well, we certainly have had the option of taking out General Soleimani in the past. Other presidents have had this option and passed on it because of the what they feared would be a severe strategic reaction from Iran and the consequences of that. And to your point earlier, yes, I mean, General Soleimani is not a good guy. We've known what he's done, especially against U.S. forces during Operation Iraqi Freedom and training militia forces to attack them. But the timing of this, and again, the concern, I think, from a lot of folks right now is justified, which is what is the larger strategy that the U.S. is going to have in place in regards to Iran? What are we trying to accomplish from a strategic standpoint? You cannot use military force as the sole option as you're trying to reach a strategic decision or a strategic outcome. You're going to need diplomacy. You're going to need other elements of national power. And it's going to have an impact, in the very short term in our fight against ISIS, because all of our military forces in the region right now are going to have to go into a defensive posture. They've got to focus on force protection. There's concern about a response. We're going to have to see, what they decide internally and whether they want to kind of satisfy internal domestic politics, or do they want to do something that will be seen as an escalation by the U.S., which might trigger another response.
Well, to that point and how they might respond, I think it's interesting. We go back to September, and on those Saudi oil reserves that were attacked, and most people believe, and I think rightfully so, the Iranians had their fingerprints on it. The quantum leap, as it was described in print today, that these drones have for precision and how far away that they can be sent from. Now, especially since we do have a lot of military positions as a result of what happened just a few days ago. Talk about that as a concern, because obviously we're the overwhelming superpower here, but there's been an advent in technology that allows even Iran at its capacity right now to do a lot of damage here and from distance.
Absolutely. I mean, the Iranians do have one of the largest, I think maybe the largest missile force in the area. They have not been very accurate with those weapons, but certainly they now have possessed drone technology just like we have, and they can use those drones to attack. And I think that's really where the concern is right now, or the analysis is going is will the Iranians, attack a U.S. military base directly? That would be seen as probably an escalation of the conflict. And so they may choose not to go that route and attack a softer target with maybe strategic value, but not a direct attack on U.S. forces. I think the other thing we have to be concerned about is, General Soleimani was training a lot of these proxy forces throughout the region. Some of these forces may take some actions on their own as a result of this, and so they may not necessarily wait for guidance from Iran, and they may want to strike back as a result of this.
So, and that leads me to my last question, because I think if there's two legitimate problems people have with this, I guess the third one in terms of there was never any consultation. There's been still to this day, we're still waiting for the compelling evidence that there was an imminent threat to troops here, especially when we're getting some counter evidence that there was some meetings that were scheduled that possibly could have de-escalated the situation that were going on. Be that as it may, it's like we're looking for a plan now after the attack. But then the other part is The president's insistence on spiking the football after this happened, talking about going after cultural sites. And we know this obviously in conjunction to some of the other things that he's already said right now regarding torture, etc. Doesn't that just make this even that much harder? Where you're all but goading Iran to have to respond, not just with the killing, but also with how we reacted after the fact?
Yeah, I think, unfortunately, the president's tweet about the cultural sites is very unfortunate. So I don't think that's the right answer. Fortunately for us, we have excellent military commanders, and we have great judge advocate generals. And so so the viewers understand when a military strike is going through an approval process, there are always lawyers involved. And one of the things they look at is that the target has to have military value. So you cannot strike a target simply, a cultural target simply because it's a cultural site. It has to have military value. So there has to be military forces hiding in that site or something along those lines. So I'm confident that at least our judge advocate generals and our military commanders are not going to attack a cultural site purely for a symbolic reason like that. But of course, it only creates more problems for the diplomatic efforts when the president says these things, because that's something that's very sensitive to everybody, but especially to folks in the Middle East. They're very sensitive to their cultural sites. And so this will likely, again, it will kind of stir up potentially the escalation. And it's unfortunate that he did respond in that way. But I think we should have confidence that our military forces are not going to do that. I think the Secretary of Defense stated that pretty clearly just yesterday.
I just resent the fact they were even put in a position where they didn't even need to be. But Kendric, thank you so much for a few. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, but when we come back, much more on the president's standoff with Iran and his continuing focus on something no other president has ever fixated on during times of conflict. We talk about these cultural sites. Well, after the break, we're going to show you what we're talking about, the places that Trump is threatening and why in Iran the crowds have been filling every location with protests. We're going to also try and figure out why he's so focused on these locations and the dangers that could bring to America.